Another thing that we often do, every young person desires this. We want our kids to have a rounded, complete and successful education. 70% of boys no longer can aspire to university. But when you do widen the road, what happens is you get faster flow, and then people think immediately, wow, there's a road that's really fast there, and they divert their normal route to go on the faster road, and very soon you're back to where you started from, because the advantage you got from widening the road soon reduces because the flow of traffic on the road increases again. Now this kind of situation is very commonplace, it's nothing special. But today I want to take a case that all of you are familiar with, and it's a lesson, seeing as most of you are much younger than I am, that you should remember into the future as you watch policy being made. You yourself might be helping to make policy, or you might be a critic of policy that government makes. But either way, the story starts on the 12th of April 2022. Now you all remember that day, because that's the day we discovered second order effects. The day Sri Lanka announced that it was insolvent. And you remember the consequences. Long petrol queues, long gas queues. Protests slowly began in May. In June they intensified. And by the 9th of July, 100,000 young people got on the streets of Colombo and entered the President's house and the President's office peacefully and caused Gotabaya Rajapaksa to run away from the country 4 days later. That was, I think, in all your lives, watching a peaceful revolution take place in real time. Peaceful revolutions are really rare in the world. If you think about it, since the American Revolution, very few revolutions worldwide have ended up better than they started. If you look at the Arab Spring, starting from Tunisia, going through Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, ending up more recently in Bangladesh, that whole series of revolutions ended up worse than they started. They started to solve one problem and they got into a worse predicament. There was bloodshed, there was destruction of public property. In Sri Lanka, we didn't see any of those things. But the story started, as far as Mr. Rajapaksa was concerned, in November 2019 when he was elected, by his decision to do two things that seemed eminently sensible. Certainly nobody complained at the time. The first was to slash taxes, because if you reduce taxation, people would have more capital to put back either into spending, in which case you help GDP, or to put into investment, in which case also you help economic growth. So he wanted to cut taxes for that reason. He also wanted to increase public spending, because public spending included creating places like this, creating lovely walkways, restaurants, public facilities, which would, on the one hand, boost growth, and on the other hand, increase his popularity. So nobody complained at the time. But what he also failed to factor in was the cost that these interventions were expensive. Government revenue from taxes fell by about 500 billion rupees, and the spree of public spending resulted in about another 600 billion rupees of unforeseen expenditure, more than ₹1 trillion in all. Now, Gotabaya Rajapaksa wasn't a particularly educated man. He was not a person with a great intellect. But he was guided by people with supreme intellects, like Dr. P.B. Jayasundara, PhD from the University of Boston, Professor W.D. Lakshman, PhD in economics from Oxford, head of the Department of Economics at Colombo University, Vice Chancellor of Colombo University, who then was Governor of the Central Bank. Why didn't these extremely smart people see that that policy of reducing taxation and increasing public spending at the same time was somehow not a good idea? Fact is, they didn't. In order to fund the government through this period, they increased government borrowing by 40 percentage points. Unprecedented level of government borrowing. and they used up pretty much all the reserves that the government had got. And eventually were forced to print 1.7 trillion rupees in order to keep the country going. Now, in the middle of all this, COVID happened, and so the economic slowdown that resulted from COVID resulted in yet more problems for the economy. They were guided into this path even more strongly by people like Dr. Kenneth De Silva, another very smart guy, who is chairman of the central bank's consultative system for their Financial Stability Consultative Committee chair. He famously addressed the issue that was being raised then publicly, saying all this money printing is going to result in inflation, by giving this famous interview to the Daily Mirror and Sunday Times, which I cut out and kept on that day in 2021, because when I read it, I thought to myself, I'm going to need this newspaper in the future. And I still have it, because it seemed to me so counterintuitive, but who am I? He's a PhD in economics, I'm a citizen. And I thought, perhaps he's right. But it turned out that he wasn't, because by September of 2022, inflation was running at 70%. The value of your rupees, my rupees, halved in that 1 year, and the whole country paid the price of that, what appeared to be a sensible intervention because of the second order effect of inflation, which they didn't factor in when they did the financial stimulus. But very clever people did that. The problem, however, didn't start with Gotabaya Rajapaksa. It started with this gentleman 5 years before. At the time Maithripala Sirisena became president in 2014, there was a problem brewing in Sri Lanka. A problem that you will probably remember, but that didn't come into our consciousness because we live in Colombo. This was the problem of chronic kidney disease. CKDU was then a massive issue. 40,000 people had registered as kidney patients needing dialysis. The government hospitals couldn't cope. And in a big arc running east from Nochiyagama across Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, down to Ampara, Mahayangana, and then inland to Hambantota, a great C-shaped arc around the hill country, but in the dry zone. People were getting chronic kidney disease. And very soon, people like the Venerable Athurali Ratana were pointing a finger at one particular herbicide called glyphosate, and caused Maithripala Sirisena, without any consultation with the agriculture or science establishment, to suddenly ban glyphosate. Within days of his banning it, people began suddenly realizing that glyphosate isn't used in the areas that have kidney disease. It's used mainly in the tea plantations. There are different weedicides that are used with rice and vegetables. The National Academy of Sciences stepped in to say that the cause of chronic kidney disease remained unknown, and they couldn't see a link between glyphosate and chronic kidney disease. But once politicians make a decision, they don't like to backtrack, and so Maithripala Sirisena didn't either. Then stepped into the fray another really clever guy. Professor Channa Jayasumana is a professor of pharmacology at Rajarata University, or he was at the time. He also pointed a finger at glyphosate. So this kind of strengthened Maithripala Sirisena's views. Now, Channa Jayasumana, if you remember, was the gentleman who prescribed the Dhammika Paniya and the Sudarshana Paniya to treat COVID-19, which later tests showed to be without substantial validity. And he was aided and abetted by the president of the Government Medical Officers Association, a brilliant doctor, Dr. Anuruddha Padaniya, who was a consultant pediatric neurologist. Dr. Padaniya held that we should ban all agrochemicals in Sri Lanka and make Sri Lanka a totally organic country. But Maithripala Sirisena wasn't convinced, because he was getting pushback on glyphosate, especially from the tea industry, and he dithered until the end of his term. So when Gotabaya Rajapaksa became president, Dr. Anuruddha Padeniya was not far. And he quickly got the ear of the new president. And so on the 6th of May 2021, when Sri Lanka hadn't quite yet recovered from COVID-19, President Rajapaksa banned all fertilizers and all agrochemicals from use and import in Sri Lanka. He wanted Sri Lanka to be the world's first totally organic nation. It was a policy intervention that was very dramatic. Now, if you remember, people were very frightened of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. It's all right to criticize him now, but at the time, nobody said a word, not even me. And so I chose Anuruddha Padeniya as my target for criticism because I didn't dare go against Gotabaya Rajapaksa. After all, Lasantha Wickramatunge was one of my best friends. So I know what those people can get up to. And I issued my first YouTube video in Sinhala criticizing this whole organic policy. It was more than an hour long and more than 150,000 people saw that. And it finally gave government servants, scientists in the agricultural community a little voice to speak up. But when they spoke up, they quickly found that they were being fired. My good friend, Professor Buddhi Marambe, Professor of Agriculture at the University of Peradeniya, advisor on agriculture of the ministry, or the Minister of Agriculture at the time, was fired overnight for voicing his concerns in an internal government meeting, not even to the media. But the results of Mr. Rajapaksa's policy intervention were only too soon to be visible. In 2022, having attained self-sufficiency several years earlier, Sri Lanka had to import more than 750,000 tons of rice. Since the glyphosate ban in 2015 by President Sirisena, the tea industry went into what seems to be a chronic and permanent decline. Tea production has fallen by more than 20% since then, a loss of opportunity, a loss of revenue of more than $100 million per year. Totaled, that comes to more than $1 billion of lost income for the country. And in the meantime, although Sri Lanka took this world's first step in banning glyphosate, the governments of the United States, the EU, Japan, Australia, the FAO, the WHO all recognize glyphosate as safe to use when correctly used according to their recommendations. So the 9th of July 2022 was for me, and I'm sure for many of you who might have been there, the proudest day of my life. Maybe second to the day we won the World Cup in 1996, but certainly up there. It was a day in which we were all proud to be Sri Lankans because we did something nobody else had done. We peacefully evicted a government that was badly off track. And what did the protesters do? Did they stage a coup? Did they take over the government? Their worst excess was to jump in the presidential swimming pool. And having done that, they went home and let the Constitution take care of business. That is a revolution from which the whole world can learn. It's the one place in which Sri Lanka innovated in a way that it had never done before. So when we look at that slew of innovations that were made by Maithripala Sirisena and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the good intentions behind each one are manifestly clear. Slash taxes, increase public spending, borrow unsustainably, because usually governments could borrow in Sri Lanka because it's future generations that pay it back. But when you get a credit crunch like we got, then you have to take care of that. So that's what happened, that went wrong. They printed money because important intellectuals and economists told them that nothing would happen if you printed money, as I showed you. And they banned agrochemicals, hoping that it will address CKDU, the kidney disease, help the environment, and make Sri Lankan agricultural exports like tea get a premium value in the world market as a result of the organic label. Of course, all those outcomes didn't work out the way they were intended. because of second order effects. They hadn't thought it through. But thinking these things through retrospectively, as they say, hindsight is 20/20, it's very easy to look back on it and see where it went wrong. But at the time, very few people, even people who like to think that they have some kind of prophetic voice like myself, had really thought it through. And so we didn't see it coming. But when it came, it collapsed our economy and we all lost out. So what about CKDU? Chronic kidney disease to this day has not been solved. It is a classic second order problem, but we don't know what the solution is. It's a really cool problem, though I must say it's a tragedy for the people who have kidney disease. I'm one of them, not for the same reasons, so I'm sympathetic to the cause, but we still don't know what caused the problem. But it's a cool problem, because this is the region of Sri Lanka that had kidney disease. You can see from the pink and red where it was serious. And there is a very close correlation between that region and the region in which groundwater fluoride is highest. Now we all know that correlation is not the same as causation, and we haven't yet found out what the intervening process is that causes kidney disease. Whether fluoride is even implicated, we don't know. There's only a correlation. But in these past 20 years, when CKDU has been a problem, we know we have had more than 300 scientific studies published. In 2022 alone, there was one paper being published in the scientific literature every week on this problem. Hundreds of studies later, the WHO convened a special international conference of kidney experts in Sri Lanka. But we haven't found out what happened. All we do know for a fact, and what was discovered quite early in the day, was that everyone who was getting CKD was getting it in a household in which they were drinking water drawn from a well. They were drinking groundwater. Anuradhapura, for example, is surrounded by villages that have CKD. But in the city of Anuradhapura, which gets its water supply from Noravava, surface water, there was no CKD. So we very soon connected the dots to understand that this was a groundwater-led problem. Solution: reverse osmosis plants in every village, and now every village pretty much has got an RO plant. So we've solved the problem. Nobody is getting CKD now from groundwater, but we still don't know what caused it. We know that on one side there's fluoride, on the other side there's CKD, but in the middle, a chemical process, a biochemical process occurs that even the cleverest medical minds in Sri Lanka still haven't been able to find out, because it's obviously quite complicated. It's a classic second order problem. These kinds of problems are very common in government policy. For a couple of years of my life, I don't think Ganga mentioned it, one of my many jobs was to be chairman of the Tea Board for a couple of years. And at that time I was in charge of the Tea Promotion Fund. The Tea Promotion Fund is a contributory fund that earns about 800 million rupees every year. And it's got some very specific KPIs. So the KPIs are listed there. You have the promotion, by promoting Sri Lanka tea across the world, the intention is to increase the quantity of tea exported, the value of tea that is exported per kilogram, and to increase the awareness of the Ceylon tea origin across the world. Now looking at those, I don't think any of you would question those KPIs. They seem eminently sensible, but actually they're extremely foolish. Why? The quantity of tea exported is pretty much the quantity of tea that we produce. Every ounce of Ceylon tea that is produced is sold in the world market. By promoting it overseas, you can't increase that quantity. You have to increase production, but not promotion. Mistake number one. Mistake number two, the value of tea exported also is very difficult to mess with, because the tea fetches its value from the Colombo auction. Every week of the year, there's an auction in Colombo, and tea is sold in a public marketplace. So there's very little you can do to increase the value of tea in the world market. And then you come to Ceylon tea, the origin that we are trying to sell, of which we are very proud. But in 1972, the first Republican Constitution of Mrs. Sirimao Bandaranaike eliminated the name Ceylon from Sri Lanka. There is nothing in Sri Lanka that is legally called Ceylon anymore. Not only that, we asked the British Parliament to enact a special act of Parliament to get rid of the word Ceylon from the international sea. If you go to Google Maps now and type in Ceylon, there's no country in the world that has that name. Only we know it. If you ask an 18-year-old Frenchman where is Ceylon, he has no idea. We did this when I was at the Tea Board. We conducted surveys in tea buying countries to find out whether people knew where Ceylon was. Nobody could point to it on the map. And so we have lost the meaning of the place that we are trying to promote. We tell people to buy Ceylon tea, and those people have no idea where Ceylon tea is from. And at the same time, almost anyone in the world can sell Ceylon tea that comes from Argentina, from wherever. So there's no value in the brand. Why would you promote it? Because you might be promoting some other guy's tea. And as a result of that, this fund accumulates 800 million rupees every year. It can't be used, and eventually the treasury slowly steals it. Similar problem with tourism. There's a tourism fund that is much bigger than the tea fund. And here, look at the KPIs again. You want to increase the number of tourists, the length of stay for which tourists stay in Sri Lanka, and the amount of money they spend every night. What's the catch? All those three things cannot possibly go together, because if you want to increase the number of tourists, you no longer have a premium destination. When it's free for everybody to come or cheap for everybody to come, Bill Gates doesn't come there for holidays. There has to be exclusivity. So if you want to increase spend per night, you have to decrease the number of tourists who come, funnily enough. It's a normal market mechanism. And so tourism promotion in Sri Lanka also hits a roadblock because of KPIs that haven't thought through the second order effects. One of the most tragic second order effects came from a piece of advice that was published in a book, the Common Sense Book of Baby and Childcare by Benjamin Spock, a very famous American pediatrician, in 1953. Many of you are alive today because your parents didn't take his advice. He advised parents to put their babies to sleep stomach down. Why? Because if the baby regurgitated some milk and he was lying on his back, the milk would choke him and he would drown in his own milk or his own vomit. That doesn't happen with babies, funnily enough. But he, as an experienced pediatrician, didn't know that. The risk of a baby dying of sudden infant death syndrome, if they are lying face down, is 15 times higher than the risk of them dying if they are lying face up from SIDS. Eventually, it's been calculated that although his book sold 50 million copies, 5,000 times as many as my poor book sold, 60,000 people died. 60,000 babies died as a result of this advice. Now, the guys in the room know what I'm talking about here. Every time you go in the gents, you see a sign like this, because guys have a terrible habit when they stand at the urinal of dribbling on the floor, and it's somebody else's job to clean this up. The reason I'm putting this up is to indicate that when we think of second order effects, we don't usually think of human psychology. If you're designing a plane and trying to eliminate second order effects, you're basically solving a hardware problem. If you're writing code and you're thinking of second order effects, you're solving a coding problem. These are very straightforward problems to solve. When you bring human psychology into it, it's very difficult to be able to predict how people will behave. There's one example from schools where the school would end at maybe 1:30, and the parents have to come and pick up the children by 1:30. And if the parents got late, it was a real nuisance for the school, because one member of staff had to stay and be with the kids for those late coming parents, because the kids couldn't be left unattended. And so the schools imposed a fine, a penalty on parents, saying you have to pay $5 if you're later than half an hour to pick your kid up from school. And they found very quickly a second-order effect. Parents got even later to come and pick up their children because now they felt much better about it. Rather than feeling guilt about being late and keeping a teacher waiting, now it was a transaction. You paid the $5, you were paying for childcare. And so children were being kept even longer at school. Because human psychology, social psychology, works in the strangest ways. So when you want to get men to aim straight in the toilet, all the guys in the room have seen signs like this, even in Sri Lanka, you get them commonly in the men's toilets. It doesn't really work. But one place found a solution that did work. Amsterdam Airport. And they did something really clever. They painted a very realistic looking fly in the urinal. And this caused men to pay attention and aim at the fly, thinking that it was a real fly and they wanted to play games with it. Men never really grow up, believe me. I'm 70, I should know. And so, toilet cleaning costs went down by 20% in Schiphol Airport in consequence of this. But a real-world example from Sri Lanka also is illustrative of how clever thinking can solve interesting problems. This straight line is the correlation between per capita GDP and per capita blood donations on the y-axis. And as you can see, as countries get richer, the amount of blood their citizens give in blood donations rises linearly. It's actually better than linearly because the x-axis is a log curve. So this is a log linear plot, but still the story is the same. It's a very good correlation of about R of 0.8. And Sri Lanka was suffering pretty much like all those poor countries you see at the bottom there. And one of my many jobs also was 5 years in the health ministry, 6 years in the health ministry in the early 1980s. And this was a persistent problem that we had, especially once the war started seriously in 1983, of having blood shortages whenever several soldiers got injured or a landmine went off and civilians were hurt. There was an urgent need for blood. And Sri Lankans were not in the habit of giving blood. And so one very clever lady who was the director of the blood transfusion service, Dr. Nandrani D'Souza, had a brainwave. She went around the temples around Colombo and spoke to the priests and said, when you're talking, giving your sermon on Poya Day, can you say that in addition to giving dana to the temple, can they give dana of blood to the National Blood Transfusion Service? A few priests like Gangarama Podihamadru at that time and the chief priest of the Kalaniya Mahavihara started saying this to their congregations when they came in on Poya Days. And very soon, those priests called up and said to the National Blood Transfusion Service, can you come and do collections, because people are willing to give blood on Poya Day itself when they come to the temple for offerings. And they did that. And by 1988, when Nandrani D'Souza was given the Vidya Jyoti Medal by J.R. Jayawardena in recognition of this one brainwave, blood transfusion in Sri Lanka was transformed. Now the blood transfusion service gets about 85% of all its donations on Poya Days. It's a wonderful transformation of using something a little out of the box to put Sri Lanka in a place it doesn't really deserve to be. It's the only place which I can think of where we rub shoulders with Singapore. Singapore is way richer than us, but the level of giving blood on a per capita basis has us shoulder to shoulder with Singapore. Now, that is where I wanted to stop my main talk. I don't know how we are doing for time. Do we have 5 minutes? All right. So, just in case we had time, I kept a few more to try and get a little deeper into the weeds about what's going on with second order effects. Why do we fail to predict second-order consequences. When we make a plan, when we design a policy intervention, why is it that even the US military cannot imagine a simple intervention like Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz? They thought the war will be over in 4 days, remember? Now we're on day 170 today, and there's no sign of the strait being open, despite having the Sixth Fleet, aircraft carriers, destroyers, missile launchers, the works. That second-order effect was not foreseen. Part of the reason, and I think if you put your mind into the mind of President Trump, you'll recognize this, is confirmation bias. You know what your target is, destroy Iran, and you've got all these weapons, so you assume that you can do it. And so you cherry pick just that bit of data that is focused on destroying Iran without looking at all the noise that is surrounding your target and thinking that some of that noise might actually contain signals that you should take care of. We have a tendency to confirmation bias. When we come up with an idea, we think that we are right, and we stop looking for data that might contradict us. We do this all the time. Those of you who are married know that with your spouse, when you have a discussion, argument, it's pretty much minds never change because you're not listening to the other side of the argument. The other thing is that when we see something, even though we know it's wrong, we don't accept it. I'll give you a simple example. If I tell you that all 4 horizontal stripes in this picture are actually horizontal and parallel to each other, all of you will say, no, of course they're not. They're slanted. Is there anybody who thinks they look horizontal? But if I draw 2 red stripes across it, which are parallel to each other and definitely horizontal, even then everything looks skew. But if you actually look at it square by square by square, you can see that all those lines are in fact parallel to each other and horizontal. But even though your brain is reasoning and telling you the truth, at the same time you're saying, I'm not seeing the truth. And very often when we are designing policy, we have the same kind of problem. The truth is there to see, but our brain is telling us that we can't see it. Another thing that we often do when we fail to get second-order effects or understand them in advance is that we reduce a target to a metric. This you very often see in education. We want our kids to have a rounded, complete, and successful education. Every young person desires this. But then we reduce all of education to a single target, Z score. That's all that matters. And so you're aiming for Z score, you're no longer aiming for education. As a result of that, you have an education crisis on your hands. And people with huge gaps in their knowledge, people trying to get an education they cannot get, as a result of which 70% of boys no longer can aspire to university. That's another discussion. Finally, you have poorly weighted priors. I don't know how many of you are in the IT business, but if you are in the IT business, you've probably come across Bayes' theorem. Am I right? And Bayes' theorem basically shows us that human beings are Bayesian predictive machines. That's how we operate. That's how our brain works. This is not my idea. This is Anil Seth's idea. He's a brilliant cognitive scientist at the University of Sussex, and he models the human brain basically as a Bayesian machine with very good outcomes. Now, Bayesian inference looks a bit complicated when you write it as an equation, so I'll take a simple example. Say you woke up this morning and it was cloudy, and you're thinking, should I really take an umbrella with me when I go to catch the bus? It's a simple problem. What is the probability of rain? And your brain already, because you're now 20, 30, 40 years old, has got experience. It knows, even though you might not know the numbers offhand, your brain knows from experience that about 25% of all days begin cloudy. And about 15% of all days in Colombo are rainy. And about 80% of rainy days begin by being cloudy. Now this you know from experience. And your brain then does the math using this equation, plugging those numbers I just gave you in, and gives you a posterior probability that the chances of rain on that day is about 48–50%. And so you decide on that basis whether or not to carry your umbrella with you. Now, every time you climb a flight of stairs, your brain is doing Bayesian analysis. That's how your body operates. And we are basically Bayesian machines. And so when it comes to formulating policy, when you make a policy intervention, like we are going to make tomorrow with the 22nd Amendment, which will be tabled in Parliament tomorrow, you wonder what is going to happen as the second order effects of this intervention. The President says that he wants to extend the retirement age of judges for some very specific reasons, because there's a case backlog in the courts which has to be reduced. He wants to retain judicial talent in the judicial service, and he wants to reduce prison overcrowding. So those are his KPIs for the judiciary. Those are his stated KPIs. And then, if you, as young intellectuals, were to think, if I were given those KPIs and told, how should I address those problems? If you want to reduce the case backlog, you might say, make the courts more efficient. Make them work longer hours, increase their productivity. Isn't that what you do in a business? That is. If you wanted to retain judicial talent, you would incentivize them by giving them higher salaries and filling vacancies on the various benches. If you wanted to reduce prison overcrowding, you would stop unnecessary remand and give more people bail. After all, it's very difficult to exit Sri Lanka if you don't have a passport. Now, those are the things that you, as citizen intellectuals, would think of as ways of delivering on those KPIs. I don't think any of you would have thought increasing the retirement age of the people involved is going to change any of those KPIs. So, when you come to making a policy intervention, sometimes you can see that maybe what the President is aiming at here is actually the second order effects, not the primary effect. And a few years from now, you will see whether he was right or he was wrong. But we can't really predict now, even though we've gone through the whole predictive procedure, we can't really predict what those second order effects are going to be. So thank you, I'm going to stop there. I didn't talk about biodiversity, I apologize, maybe next time. But if you have questions about this, or discussion, or argument, or debate, or a desire to scold me for something, go for it. This is the time.